Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here in London and to share some thoughts about democracy. And just talking backstage, I was confessing that I feel more pessimistic than ever. But anyway, I'll try to bring here some ideas of what we have been looking at in the field of democracy. Democracy Earth is a non-profit organization. We're a foundation. We build open source software using peer-to-peer protocols to deploy censorship-resistant democracies over the internet. I come from Argentina. Argentina is a country that is consistently going from crisis to crisis, has a very weak institutional has a very weak institutional model. It's a very weak democracy, but still a place where people are very much politicized and in the streets trying to bring ideas that help improve society. And one of the things about democracy that I've learned throughout the past 5 years running Democracy Earth is that ultimately what we want is systems that are built for deep conflicts. I promise that I won't mention the word Brexit. Just gonna get that out of the presentation. But one of the reasons organizations or communities, when they decide to go out and make a decision with a vote, is usually the mechanism of last resort. Most organizations and most constituencies would rather make decisions through consensus or through common sense, but when there's a contentious event or there's something that is challenging a community, that's when usually people go out for a vote. And votes can be, this means that democracies get implemented in contexts where these are contexts of deep conflicts. These are contexts where there's a very high stakes decision to be made. And usually what this means, in our view, is that the higher the risk, the higher the need for legitimacy in the decision-making process. And legitimacy is a critical component. We want to make a democracy that works is a democracy where the losing side also can agree with the result, rather than splitting a society apart or breaking a society apart. So this also brings another problem, that when we try to implement solutions in contexts that are facing a deep conflict, this means that some parts of that constituency will try to hijack the system, will try to attack the decision-making system. So throughout the last 5 years in Democracy Earth, we try to find real context. Democracies are not surveys, they are not polls. We want to find organizations that are facing a deep conflict, that are willing to surrender their decision-making process to an innovative way of doing democracy, either through digital form or through much more interesting rules than just first past the post voting. And throughout these past 5 years, I'm going to share with you some of these pilots, some of these experiences that we have worked with in the past. In every single implementation we made, we have been attacked in one way or another. And we have discovered one vulnerability or one weakness of the system we were trying to implement. So my personal story with these ideas begins in 2012, back in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where with a group of friends and colleagues, we started a political party called Partido della Red, or the Net Party in English. And the whole ideology of this party was very simple, and it can be summarized in a tweet. We would put candidates for Congress that are committed to vote in Congress always according to what people tell them online how to vote. That's the entire ideology of the party. So we ran actually for elections in 2013. In 2013, we ran for our first election as an independent party. And it was an incredible experience because for me, it was my first time as an activist, my first time working for a set of political ideas, discovering a lot of young people that were willing to start thinking about democracy in a new way, using the language of the digital generation. And the experience of campaigning, of going out in the streets, of talking to everyone about the possibility of improving democracy this way, is one of the most fascinating experiences I've been through in my life. One of the funniest things we did during that campaign is that we always talked about putting a Trojan legislator in Congress that does not look like a real legislator, because in reality he will be simply a puppet of the people being used on that will be voting over the internet. So we literally built a 4-meter tall Trojan horse that we paraded through the streets of Buenos Aires. You can see a picture of it, of that horse there. And we always say that we made campaigning with a work of art, not marketing, but art. So it was incredible, going through the streets with Buenos Aires with a massive Trojan horse, telling the citizens of my city that we were going to hack the Congress. We needed 3% of the votes to get the candidate elected. We only got 1.2, but it was enough to get something started. And we started putting more emphasis and more focus on the software. Even though we didn't get the candidate elected, in 2014, we were able to make the first implementation of our software with the City Congress of Buenos Aires, where 16 political parties contributed a bill, each party, and 30,000 citizens voted online to decide which bill would be treated in the floor of the Congress, with official support from the Congress. This was our first pilot, making digital democracy. Our first assumption was, if we make it open source, then it's a software anyone can audit and contribute to, and it definitely was a good first step to this problem. But very soon we found out, when we made this implementation, that the Workers' Party, they suddenly flooded the system with 6,000 fake identities, or significantly more identities than the other parties competing in this process, which made us, when we look at the IPs and we try to analyze a little bit of the data, we realized, open source is not enough. If the Workers' Party can come, or any party can come and try to subvert the system with fake identities, then we need to put, we need to put more emphasis on and try to understand better the problem of how we give voter rights over these platforms. But nonetheless, it was a great experience. Actually, we had to accept the result that the Workers' Party. It was actually a very good bill about giving about the pensions of the elder in the city of Buenos Aires. That bill got treated in the floor. The Workers' Party wanted to push that into the floor of the Congress. It didn't get approved by the Congress later. It was a pity, but it was a first pilot, a first experience to do democracy in a digital way in Latin America, in South America, in my country. Now, there's a lot I can tell you also about the dark side of this. Engaging in politics in a country like Argentina was also one of the most terrifying experiences in my life. We had Secret Service agents infiltrating party meetings, trying to sabotage these meetings to scare people away from engaging with a new party like ours. I had meetings with some politicians, and when I go back to my car, I find the wheels of my car slashed. I got asked to bribe a federal judge in order to run for the next election in 2015, which of course I did not do, and I actually wrote a long article describing the details of how this happened. But it's really scary when there's a lot of hypothesis of how corrupt and how violent the political system is in Latin America. It's even worse than what I imagined. And it was the only period in my life that I actually faced 2 panic attacks. And it made me really question if it actually made any sense to go and try to change the system from within. Because when I see the politicians and the people that become successful in that game, I wonder if I really want to become one of them. So that really pushed me in the direction of thinking, if you try to change the system from within, it's much more likely that you will end up being changed by the system first. So in 2015, we got very lucky, and we got an incredible opportunity that Silicon Valley accelerator called Y Combinator, they looked at what we did in Buenos Aires, and they invited us to California to start thinking about democracy from a more global perspective. And because it's YC, it's a great organization that has a lot of the best software engineers in the world helping you out, we started putting more focus on building technology. And we went from a philosophy of trying to change the system from within, the Trojan philosophy, to a philosophy of let's build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. A Buckminster-Fuller, like this dome here, which is the architecture of Buckminster-Fuller philosophy. So in 2015, we started Democracy Earth as an organization, a non-profit organization with this first check from YC, trying to understand how to build technology for democracy. And because I'm from Argentina and I come from a country that has the worst currency in the world, after Venezuela probably, I always been very much interested in the world of crypto and the use of Bitcoin and the blockchain-based technology to create systems that can be censorship resistant. So with Democracy Earth, the first years we started looking for context where we can implement shadow referendums that can help these movements have a powerful voice. One of the most interesting implementations we did was actually in Hong Kong with the umbrella movement. They were doing a voting system over Telegram, and because the year before they had been hacked by Chinese hackers, they wanted to find a way to store votes on the Bitcoin blockchain. So we started building a system that was able to store using a Bitcoin transaction. Technically speaking, you include the root of a Merkle tree, which is a tree that has multiple information that are connected to that bit of strings related. And in the tree, we would store up to 10,000 votes compressed in the root of the Merkle tree, which is less than 80 bytes. And in Bitcoin, you can include up to 80 bytes of information in a transaction. So with just a few cents of a Bitcoin transaction, we could include up to 10,000 votes on the Bitcoin blockchain. And we would use that as a way to make sure that no one is tampering with the servers where the votes are stored in this selection made for the Hong Kong umbrella movement. Anyway, we still got hacked. They hacked, the Chinese hackers tampered with Telegram and the communication with Telegram. But you know, it was one of our first explorations on how we can use the blockchain, or how we can use technology like Bitcoin for other than just financial purposes and start using it for political purposes. We also did a liquid democracy implementation, which was a very exciting idea back then for Colombia. Colombia was having the peace referendum in 2016. So we decided to allow Colombian expats, Colombians that were not allowed to vote in their home country because they were living abroad, to vote on this peace referendum in a shadow election, just like we did in Hong Kong, which was also a shadow election, a shadow referendum, to vote not only over the peace agreement as a whole, but on each article, on each aspect of the peace agreement. We tried the idea of liquid democracy. What we found out is that when the stakes are very high, people are very opinionated and very rarely are willing to delegate their vote. So we had less than 3% of delegations happening. Liquid democracy has other issues which, you know, if you have multiple delegations, it can also lead to a monopoly or a duopoly, and you will end up having Republicans and Democrats like we see in the traditional political world most times. But it was an interesting experience nonetheless, because we were able to find the deal breaker of the peace referendum. Colombians pretty much agreed on every aspect of the peace agreement, but if you look at the official election, actually the 51% of the people in Colombia voted for no to that peace agreement. And what we found out in our own implementation was that the deal breaker, the one issue where every Colombian was in disagreement with the peace referendum, with the peace agreement, was giving political rights to the FARC, giving political rights to the Marxist guerrilla, which implied giving them $15 million every year as a budget, and by de facto 5 seats in the Senate without even going to elections. So it was an interesting way of trying to look deeper into the reasons of why actually the no won in the official election. Then in 2017, for the Partido de la Red, we had an internal decision to decide whether the party would be allowed to make alliances with other parties or not in the upcoming election of the year 2017. And my personal position was I was completely against the party making other alliances. But of course, the other side of the party was willing to make an alliance because they had something cooked up. So we went for a vote. And it was one of the most interesting votes because, again, It was a very high-stakes decision. And what we found there, even though we had a clear registry of who were able to vote, the party had 1,200 affiliate members. The persons that were controlling the database, they had their own bias in that election. And because they had their own bias, they were accelerating certain people to get the right to vote and delaying other people to get the right to vote. And that single point of failure led to tumbling the outcome of the election by controlling the timing and when you open the access to a voter in the span of that time. So that made us realize, again, how relevant it is to find a way of decentralizing the consensus that gives rights to voters to vote in the digital spectrum, in the digital world. In 2018, we had, for the first time, a congressman actually willing to vote according to the people, how the people would tell him to vote online. And this was a very relevant bill. It was, I would argue, the most relevant bill being ever discussed, at least since I have a memory, in the Congress of Buenos Aires, which was a bill about legalizing abortion. Obviously, a very sensitive topic, something that mobilized all of Argentine society, and is still being mobilized because of this. And one congressman decided that he would vote according to the people's will online using our software. So the interesting thing here was that 14,000 people voted in this case. It wasn't much, but he tried to keep a tight control over the identity registries. He did a fairly good job on that aspect. But he had, even though the general vote gave 53% were willing to vote for yes to legalize abortion, his constituency, which is a province in Argentina, Tucumán, decided 70 to 80% to not vote according to vote for no on the legalization of abortion. And he, as a congressman, he decided to vote according to his province criteria rather than the general criteria. I think that he actually voted how he wanted to vote personally, and he just adapted his subjective point of view to how he interpreted the data. So again, it was interesting for us to see what was this idea of having a congressman voting always according to people's will online, and seeing it in reality at a very high stakes, a very important bill, and seeing this congressman, adapt his subjectivity to eventually vote how he wanted to vote. These are all lessons that we are looking, in order to understand how complex democracy can actually be. In 2018, we started working with crypto networks, with decentralized networks. A great pilot that we did was with Blockstack, which is a blockchain that tries to allow developers to build decentralized applications using their protocol. Blockstack every month gives $100,000 as a subsidy to developers to fund their efforts. And through a 6-month period, we use our software to allow token holders, Blockstack investors, to decide how to distribute this subsidy, this monthly subsidy of $100,000 to developers. This was basic participatory budgeting. People were voting with their tokens how to allocate the budget. And what we found here, even though it worked for the most part, we did find collusion. We find suddenly investors that would take all of their tokens and put these tokens into a new coming application that might not be the best application for the platform, but it's something that serves the interest of those investors. So we didn't find, for the most part, decisions that were putting the common good first. We find, which is a rational choice, decisions that were putting the selfish interests of the voters first. So that's one of the weak points of how participatory budgeting works. But in a more hopeful note, in 2019, and I'm arriving to our present, we did this, our last pilot was for the state of Colorado in the United States, and we implemented a new idea that is quadratic voting. Quadratic voting is one of the ideas present on this book written by Glenn Weil. The book is called Radical Markets, and is this idea of the tradition of radicalism that is implementing liberal ideas to everything, not just to markets, but to political rights, to property, to a lot of aspects that are not usually put under the lens of liberal ideas. Quadratic voting is a very interesting idea because every voter gets a same set of credits or tokens, and you can vote on issues, but the more votes you put on a given issue, it will cost you exponentially. So if you put 3 votes on an issue that you care about, it will cost you 9 tokens. If you put 4 votes, it will cost you 16 tokens. So the more you scream, even though you can scream as loud as you want, but you won't be heard as loud as you want. And this is a kind of voting that prevents zealotry. You can definitely put all of your tokens to defend an idea, but that strength in that voice that economic impact will be mitigated by the effect of using this exponential quadratic cost. And it's specific a property that happens with square roots or powers of 2. So the interesting thing about quadratic voting, and one of the properties of this system that I like the most, is that the winning idea will also be the idea that will satisfy the largest amount of individual voters. So it will be an idea that has a high degree of legitimacy. And when we look at the data, usually in quadratic votes, people don't go to the extremes, and you will find most of the votes trying to find consensus at the center of things. So usually quadratic votes have a more bell-like distribution of the data, rather than polarizing data where people either strongly agree or strongly disagree on something. So it's a very promising new way of tallying votes. And the reason we have first past the post voting, the 51% rule, is really an idea that comes from the French Revolution, and this political economist Condorcet came out with this concept, and this concept has been legitimized through our votes and political experience the last 200 years. But there's no reason why we shouldn't be questioning how we tally and how we compute votes. Definitely the purpose of democracy is trying to find some common good. In the experience we did with Colorado, we worked with the Democratic Caucus of the lower house of Colorado. It's 41 legislators. It was the legislators that were voting. So it was a very curated environment in terms of identifying the voters, that they decided over 107 bills that were going to be using a budget of a total of $150 million of the Colorado House. And the interesting thing is that of the 107 bills, only 5 did not get a single vote, and the distribution of votes was very linear, very, very organic, where the first winning vote, the bill that got most votes was a bill that was titled "Equal Pay for Equal Work," which makes a lot of sense since this was a test made with a pilot made with the Democratic Caucus of Colorado. So one of the things that we have been trying to do is we know the world of politics because we have started a political party and we have been engaged with political movements. And we know the world of technology. We have seen the rise of blockchain-based networks and the cryptocurrency and what that can mean in terms of giving power back to the people. So what we find that is an important mission for us coming from Democracy Years is to build this bridge between crypto and politics, and how we can make politics much more accountable in the way blockchains bring more transparency, and how we can make crypto start facing challenges that are more than just sophisticated financial tools, and start facing some of the issues that our societies are facing. We have seen in the last 5 years an emergence of movements and groups across the whole world that are looking into the world of digital democracy and implementing new ideas in the field of politics. That is really very inspiring. We have found organizations like the Party Revolución Democrática in Chile, which was born out of the student movement there that made it to the Congress. The Disidentes movement in Venezuela. This is an incredible organization that is using digital technology to help the dissidents organize beyond the radar of the government, and cryptography is extremely relevant for them in a context like Venezuela. the radical exchange movement led by Glenn Weil, the author of the idea of quadratic voting. So we have there's some hope that we are seeing a new wave of political movements and organizations that are willing to innovate in this field. But it's a challenge. It's a political challenge to engage our politicians and our political class with these new ideas. Coming from Democracy Earth, we have an open source project called Sovereign, which is a web application that serves as an interface with Web3 and blockchain-based networks that allows for the governance and implementing different voting schemes with using decentralized technology, using any kind of ERC20 token or even ERC721 tokens, and use those tools for the governance of communities. We're actually working now with Decentralized, which is an interesting project that is trying to do virtual reality using crypto and using ERC non-fungible tokens on the Ethereum blockchain to represent property, to represent land. And the governance of virtual land is an interesting challenge to look into where we can implement some of these new ideas, where there's real economic interest between the landowners of this virtual reality world. But when we look at the problem of governance and trying to project, what's at stake looking into the future and what are some of the biggest challenges, certainly the rise of deep learning or machine learning techniques that are able to empower the capacity of misinformation in society is, the very meme of fake news is really a very concerning aspect of democracy. One of the challenges of democracy is not simply scaling the ability to vote, but really it's about scaling the ability to understand what is being voted. And if we have techniques that can spread a lot of misinformation in society, that ability to understand what is being voted can be hijacked. All of these faces that you see here, none of these humans actually exist. These are all computer-generated faces that are, this comes from a paper that was released in December last year that uses a technique called GAN, or generative adversarial networks, which are competing neural networks where there's a discriminator and a generator, and they're able to combine different features, and they can generate fake pictures, deepfakes like these ones, but they also can generate fake voices. They can emulate voices of other people. So in a world that is deeply driven by the conversations that we see in the media, this kind of misinformation can be a very risky thing if we start projecting what computers can do looking into the future. So how are we going to deal with deep fakes? This definitely keeps me awake at night. Another aspect is specific to the world of blockchain. 99.999% of blockchain projects are fundamentally plutocratic. Most of the projects, because blockchain lacks a formal identity, it's not Facebook. You don't have formalization of human identities in the world of blockchain. This means that most of the governance of projects out there, they are really systems where people vote with their money, or vote with their tokens, or vote with their assets. And what we find in some of these votes is that usually there was an interesting case recently with a network called Aragon, where at the very last minute, a whale voter that holds a large amount of tokens decided the outcome of the election for everyone else. People were voting with their tokens over 8 or 10 different issues, and at the very last minute, this whale with $400,000 worth of tokens bought the election by simply looking at how everyone else was voting, and at the last minute allocating tokens in a way that would benefit the interest of this individual voter. And this is the problem with voting with your money. There's a reason why shareholders of a company ultimately decide to have a CEO and delegate all of their decisions to a CEO. That's a much more efficient way of making decisions when the interests are aligned to the interests of capital. So we don't have a way right now of understanding how we can formalize human identity over decentralized networks, or how we can give people identity without creating all over again a Big Brother or a Facebook or a Google.
How can we give human rights over the internet in a way that is not captured by a single Orwellian entity? And this is one of the key challenges that we're trying to address coming from Democracy Earth and from our research. So today we're putting some emphasis on researching how we can implement solutions that allow for on-chain quadratic voting. We find that this can be an interesting mechanism for the world of blockchains, where one of the main political actions that happens in blockchain networks is the ability to fork, where a minority that disagrees with how the protocol behaves or how the protocol works can fork and build their own version of the protocol and have a community split in two and break some of the cohesive and the consensus around a given idea in the world of crypto. So in order to keep communities together, we need to find mechanisms that allow for more legitimacy in the decision-making process, where it satisfies the largest amount of individual voters. So we're looking into on-chain quadratic voting, but what we want to use on-chain quadratic voting for first is to create a system that allows us to validate human participants over decentralized networks. To use quadratic voting in systems where we can curate the curators. Ultimately, democracy is really about answering this question: who watches the watchmen? And in order to find a system that can give human rights, that can give voter rights over decentralized networks, we're working on this pilot implementation to understand if quadratic voting can help us create registries of identities on the blockchain that can start giving can help people acknowledge where the humans are in these networks. Now, understanding where the humans are in a world of AI, of machine learning, is not easy. So there's a field in computation that can be very interesting for this problem. That is the field of Turing tests. The Turing test, very well-known test, is a test to tell humans from robots apart. And in the last decade, it has been used mostly by Google and all of these Silicon Valley companies to help to tell humans from robots apart. But with every exercise that we complete doing a Turing test or a reCAPTCHA or one of those tests, we usually are making a test that helps improve their AI, that helps train their AI. So how can we do Turing tests that cannot be captured by AI? What does a Turing-resistant proof actually mean? So in the world of AI, there's a scope of problems that are AI hard. And these are problems that are not about pattern recognition. Anything that is about pattern recognition, you can put a neural network there and brute force and start recognizing the patterns on the information. So this needs to be problems that are abstract. This needs to be problems that are more about reading between the lines or joining the dots than just simply looking at an image and recognizing a pattern. And because this needs to be problems that are abstract, means that these problems cannot be generated by an algorithm. If something is generated by an algorithm, it can also be exploited by an algorithm. So this needs to be problems that are human generated. So this is a very incipient field. We had only found one university in Russia that is actually researching this, that is about trying to understand how we can create mechanisms of verification where no computers are involved, and if computers wanted to be involved, they can't do anything about it. A potential format is the use of video. You can look on Google, if you type on Google blockchain dad, you will find an article about myself and how I did the birth certificate of my daughter. That is basically a video where I'm doing a video, I'm showing my daughter, my wife in the hospital hating me for doing this. And what I have done is I hash the video, I generate a code that only matches to the contents of that video file, and I include that hash in a Bitcoin transaction. So at any given point in the future, I can demonstrate that the content of that video are legitimate. It has not been corrupted because it matches this hash that lives on the Bitcoin blockchain, and that video was shot in that moment in time. And the interesting thing about video is that it's still a format that it's easy for humans to parse and process than for computers. computers and AI really require a lot of training. There's a well-known paper called Unreasonable Effectiveness of Data that demonstrates that the success of AI algorithms is not about the algorithm itself, but about the data that you feed into the algorithm. So to train a general perception of AI is still a long way to go. So video could be an interesting format to do Turing-resistant proofs. So we expect in the second half of this year to be working on some pilots in relation to test out these ideas, these models, and to explore what makes us human. What makes us human? What differentiates us from the machines? What are capacities of our ability to think? What fingerprints in our biology? What is the stuff that can really tell the humans from the machines apart? And if we are able to identify some of that stuff, what kind of protocols we can build in a world where computers, the internet, AI become a dominant way of connecting with each other. To finish, I would encourage you to research also the area of quadratic voting. There's a lot of academic work led by Glenn Weil. We are now working, some prospects working after the experience we did in Colorado. We're working with the Parliament of Canada, and there's some opportunities in California. But it's a novel idea, an interesting idea to make a voting system that where the losing side can also agree with the result, because it will put also weight on the legitimacy of the decision being made, not just on the economic capacity of the decision. To finish, I would like to leave you with this quote that I really like. It's the very last words of the last article published by Jamal Khashoggi, who said, "Through the creation of an independent international forum, isolated from the influence of nationalist governments spreading hate through propaganda, ordinary people in the Arab world would be able to address the structural problems of that their societies face." Democracy is definitely not going through a good period right now. We're being challenged from all different directions. But I would encourage you that do not lose faith and to keep fighting for something that will help, empowers us as members of our society, and to start thinking about a democracy that can start looking beyond the limits of the nation state. We have a world to take care for in this century, and we need to embrace the capacity that the internet has to build a system of governance for the planet as a whole, and hopefully, make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Santi. This topic of democracy and human rights is something that we at Fabric care a lot about. I'm from Crimea, so Russia, Ukraine, you can imagine, no more comments needed probably. Max from my team is actually from Romania, so he and his family have experienced the totalitarian regimes to kind of the full extent as well. Max will moderate our next panel discussion, which will focus on surveillance capitalism and how we can use technology to move from don't be evil to can't be evil when it comes to governments and corporations. And I'll let Max take over and introduce the other panelists that we have in here.
All right. That's great. Good to see you, man. All righty.
Great, thank you a lot for that presentation, Santi. So the reason for which I really wanted to moderate this panel and bring it together is that while I'm half Luxembourgish and I grew up in Luxembourg, which is this sort of small utopian country in the middle of Europe, I'm also half Romanian, and my family grew up through a communist regime for 40 years, and I grew up with the stories of that regime. And when I mean a communist regime, I don't mean a sort of a government that you don't agree with, but rather it means sort of your passports getting taken away. It means your best friends reporting on you. When the communist regime fell, my grandfather got a stack of 800 pages of documents written by his best friends and neighbors reporting on him whether he was eating chicken soup or chicken broth for lunch, and whether he was speaking French or Romanian on the phone, and who his daughter was playing with. And when you think about the sort of fundamental effect of such surveillance on humans, you get very close to the ideas of Bentham and Foucault on panoptical societies, where you realize that actually observance and the lack of privacy fundamentally changes how you behave, not only now, but also in the future. And when you consider to where we've arrived today in terms of society, you consider that we've actually gotten a lot further. We've moved away from a lot of these totalitarian regimes, and yet you've got sort of the Chinese credit scores that we're seeing. We realize that actually in the US, you've got facial recognition at every single airport. And when you look at the sort of the dominant business model of today for tech companies, it's all about gathering data from its users, monetizing it in some shape or form, and probably knowing what you might do in the future better than you do. And so coming to this perspective, it's an extremely important topic to discuss from our perspective, not only from the AI stage, but also from the Web3 stage. And so we have Santi, who, well, by now you know his background and all the incredible work he's done in Argentina. But we also have Vinay, who's joining us, who has an equally incredible background. And so I wanted to give him the microphone to introduce himself and why this space matters to him.
Sure. So I'm Vinay Gupta. I've been active in cryptography and civil rights since probably 97. And I was the project manager for the Ethereum launch. And I work on digital identities for physical things. But I've done a lot of work on trying to figure out what a human rights framework looks like in an age of digital technology, including one very serious project for the US Office of the Secretary of Defense, working on a genocide-resistant biometric ID card standard for use in areas that have large genocide risk. And I kind of come to this space with a much more radical critique of the problems that we face, which I'll try and take you guys through as we move forwards.
Fantastic. And so I guess to warm up a bit and get started, you've both been fantastic book recommenders to me. So I wanted to hear your perspective on what utopian or dystopian novel you consider to be the closest to the future that we're heading to today.
Well, I'm a big fan of Aldous Huxley, and I think we are closer to Brave New World in many ways. That was a very inspiring book for me. And another book that I remember reading a few years ago that is almost weird in how prophetic it can be is this essay from the late 90s called The Sovereign Individual, which is known to be Peter Thiel's favorite book. And it's a scary book in the sense that it does have this attempt to apply information theory to understand capitalism, and it comes to the conclusion of what would happen when we have cryptography, distributed cryptography, allowing us to make transactions that cannot be surveyed by the government. To read that from a book of 96, 97, and live in the world we live in today with the rise of crypto pretty much becoming the economic phenomenon of our day, it's really interesting because it helps to bring some perspective about processes that there have been some people thinking about this stuff for a long time.
For me, it's a book called Shockwave Rider, written by John Brunner in 1976. And Shockwave Rider represents bankrupt America dominated by gang violence, run by corporations. The only thing that's holding it together as a cohesive culture is a 3D video phone network that also serves documents. And democracy has been completely subverted by massive use of internet-driven opinion polling. I also wrote a novel which I consider to be pretty utopian, although a lot of people call it a dystopia, called Mother of Hydrogen, which to me is the most optimistic possible perspective that you could have on our future. And you can find that online for free. You just download it off my website.
Fantastic. That sounds like 2 books to add to the reading list. And so moving on, I guess the title of this panel is From Surveillance Capitalism to Totalitarian Regimes. But why don't we start off by discussing how surveillance capitalism might affect democracy or undermine democracy as we see it today?
So, I mean, the fundamental problem we have with democracy is that it doesn't work, right? And it doesn't work in the same way that horse-drawn carriages don't work for mass transport. We haven't updated the machinery of democracy in about 300 years. And this idea that your total democratic representation over a lifetime is basically 12 X's on pieces of paper, like, there's no way that you could expect to run a society at these kind of paces with these kind of stakes with that kind of representation for the public. And, there is a saying that, if voting changed anything, it would be illegal. And I think that we can, generally speaking, see that that is the case. Except in very, very rare occasions, ordinary individuals, even in large groups, feel that they have very little control over the direction of the planet or the direction of their lives. And a lot of that is because we just don't have anything resembling modern machinery to turn the will of the people into effective action. That stuff is all centuries out of date. We should have updated the machinery with every new technology since the printing press. It should have been updated for radio, it should have been updated for television, it should have been updated for the early internet, it should have been updated for mobile. But because we've refused to update the machinery of democracy, the actual functions of democracy have become more and more and more outmoded, while the rest of society is accelerated into a completely different structural form. So I think that this is our first problem, is that the existing systems are incredibly out of date. The second problem is that they're also incredibly vulnerable to high-tech attack. And a lot of the stuff that you've seen with, for example, Cambridge Analytica is that high-tech attack, where you take 21st century techniques and use them to attack a 17th century immune system, and you wonder why there are problems.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that sentiment. One of the things that we try to think about is, I'm more of the philosophy these days that, like I mentioned in my talk, that we need to build a new model. Working with the existing model also is dealing with an extremely corrupt game. I think there's a new generation that is definitely the big divide of our day and age is the digital divide, but it's really a generational divide. We have the internet generation and the online generation and the offline generation. So we're in the middle of that transition right now. And projecting the world that we're looking into the future, we're going to be almost an entire species. Our entire species will be changing in the way we connect, in the way we engage with the world. And what I wonder is, what would it mean to be human in that world? One of the problems of identity is that if we try to narrow down an identity into this concept of a username or a social security number or a phone number, if we try to narrow down our identities as this one-dimensional piece of information, that's a recipe for an Orwellian entity to control us. So maybe we even need to rethink what we are what our identities actually are in the political sense, or try to think a new kind of concept of political unit that helps us organize as a society at a large scale. I don't have any clear answers to this. I just can point to some research and some clues that are emerging in the field, but we definitely need to start thinking different.
Fantastic. And we are on the Web3 stage after all, so bringing it back to this topic, we now are at the stage where we have the ability to have such primitives as censorship-resistant transactions, as sovereignly held digital assets. When I talk to a lot of friends from Luxembourg or people from sort of Middle Europe, you get the point that these blockchain networks can be very useful for automated systems, for higher efficiencies, for trading systems. Whereas when you talk to people either from back home in Romania or also from South America, actually the much more poignant ideas are around this idea of sovereign and portable money or sovereign and portable identity, and that actually can keep you from the sort of grasps of potential totalitarian regimes from coming together. So what are some of the topics or some of the geopolitical aspects of this Web3 wave that you think are not being discussed enough? And where are we going with that?
So something that one of the interesting cases of use of crypto is definitely remittances, where families are able to send funds back home. And one of the most, if we look at the statistics of localbitcoins.com, it's interesting to see, for example, what's happening in Venezuela, where the rate of transmission of Bitcoin in this network is growing exponentially, and we see more and more money being used through this network probably from remittances, from families sending money back home. But when I talked with Julio Coco, who is this activist in Venezuela, he told me something that really shocked me. That he said 60% or more of the transactions that are happening in localbitcoins.com is actually money being stolen by the corrupt officials of the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan military, and they're just using Bitcoin as their new Switzerland. They cannot have a Swiss account anymore. Switzerland is no longer a thing. So, Bitcoin is a technology. Bitcoin is a technology and can be used in any way we can use a technology. But the stark reality of it is that we are also seeing this technology being used in ways that we probably wouldn't. That's probably benefiting the people that we don't want to have this technology benefiting too. one of the problems of Bitcoin in Venezuela, for example, was the fact that Bitcoin works with this algorithm called proof of work. It means that it uses a lot of energy. And actually the military, the dictatorship in Venezuela started looking at the energy footprint in the electric grid to identify where were the Bitcoin miners. And they expropriated all of the Bitcoin mining facilities. And now the largest miner in Bitcoin in Venezuela is the government itself. No wonder it's the one government that tried to launch their own cryptocurrency. We need to address this also, like the accountability of these technologies. These are technologies that are impacting society. The latest rumor that I heard in Blockchain Week in New York was that Venezuela has 7 exchanges, and there's the main operators of localbitcoins.com is a handful of Chinese brokers that are making dealings with the Central Bank of Venezuela, allowing to buy bolivars and then trading the bolivars back using Bitcoin, and that they are managing 30,000 Bitcoins, which is almost $240 million, that are actually money from the Venezuelan people stolen by Maduro and his cronies. And these are all in the Bitcoin blockchain. So I used to be a Bitcoin maximalist. I love Bitcoin. Bitcoin was an incredible, and it still is an incredible piece of technology. But I would argue that we need to really raise the bar of what these technologies, really try to think about the political impact of these technologies, not just the greedy financial aspect of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I saw a talk by Smári McCarthy and Herbert Snorrason, who went on to found the Icelandic Pirate Party in 2013 at an event called OHM. And they laid out a case that every new technology in the past 200 years that had any substantial impact was heralded by classical anarchists as being a technology of decentralization. Electric motors, motor cars, diesel generators, solar panels, every new technology that comes around, there's kind of a political fringe which grabs onto that new technology and says, right, this will finally be the thing that decentralizes society. And what happens in almost every instance is that once the technology is well enough established to have proven its utility, central powers then look at the technology and are like, I wonder what we could do with that then. And you go from having something that looks like Bitcoin to something that looks like Sesame Credit in China, the social credit rating, inside of about a generation. And this is just a repeating cycle. It happens over and over and over and over again. So the problems that we have here go far deeper than our relationship with an individual specific technology. The problem that we have here is that we have essentially no human rights, right? All of that stuff went out the window after the invention of the nuclear bomb because there's no framework that you can imagine for human rights in which giving your government the right to annihilate all life that we can prove exists in the universe is a sensible policy option. The fundamental compact between human beings and their rulers was completely annihilated with the invention of the nuclear bomb, and we haven't managed to replace it ever since, right? We're still in a position where we live in de facto nuclear dictatorships, and until we start talking about policy options which remove the nuclear capacity at the heart of the states and return us to a condition where the governments don't represent an existential threat to every single molecule of life on Earth, it's very hard for us to talk about solving the problems that we have. Because these things are sub-problems of sub-problems of sub-problems of sub-problems of sub-problems that are all anchored in place by the nuclear weapons stockpile and the attitude to life that created it. So when we start looking at these kind of solutions, you have to say, okay, how do we use technology to create a world in which the nuclear weapon is no longer a critical part of global stability? How do you use technology to create a world in which people's unwillingness to be fried in their homes by somebody else's nuclear bomb turns into long-term work on policy to eventually get rid of those capabilities? And if we're not thinking at this scale, we're not talking about having the ability to handle global warming, we're not talking about the ability to handle nanotechnology and biotechnology. Right? You're not going to see substantial realization of things like the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, in a world which is basically held together by nuclear bombs. And so to get into a position where we've got real leverage on these kind of issues, we have to start talking about how do we design a path to a post-nuclear world in which human beings don't drive starvation. And for that, you have to start thinking about a single global political regime. You have to start talking about one person, one vote for the entire world in a single global polity, because that's the only way that we can bring down the barriers between people that we're currently maintaining with nuclear bombs. And this might be a 1 century, 2 century project, but that's how long it took to get every single human being a vote in the kind of democracy we have now. Franchise was won by category after category after category of people over centuries, moving from a position where only the elites could vote to where everybody can vote. And we need to repeat that process again, but at a global scale. And that's not an unrealistic goal. It might take us a long time, but if we don't get explicit that this is the goal, what's going to happen is that we will win small victory after small victory after small victory, but we will never touch the problems which generate these smaller problems, and then the smaller problems will just remanifest in different places, right? You need an underlying realistic political radicalism. You know, you need to say, look, it's basically Starfleet or bust. And if we're not moving towards those kind of approaches to a single just global governance framework, everything else will be a partial solution which gets overturned by a higher level of governance that says, okay, we've had enough of that. That looks far too much like power going into the hands of people that aren't supposed to have it, and they'll just flip over the revolutions one at a time, as we've seen happen over and over again in South America.
I like it.
And this is your responsibility to implement.
And I guess moving away a bit from the sort of geopolitical side and coming back to the capitalism side, if we look at where capitalism today, it's largely a set of businesses that are built based off of open source technology to a large extent, which I know Eleftherios will talk about soon, and monetizing users' data, so gathering data from their customers and their users and using it in ways that were not expected before. And so, to quote Zizek in his new book, The Relevance of the Communist Manifesto, which Santi recommended, we've moved away from the capitalists using forced and work labor to using the general intellect that is produced by every individual, whether it be our data or content or even our identities that we own. And so where do you see the business models of tomorrow moving to? Do we have a route towards more collective capitalism that can include some of these technologies to move away from some of these sort of surveillance capitalistic states that we have today?
It's you know, thinking about the business models. One thing that I found really interesting in the world of crypto, and crypto has a broad range of applications and a broad range of innovations. The one community that I find that it's most advanced when it comes to discuss governance and new structures of capital is Ethereum. In Ethereum, there's a lot of very exciting innovation of people that are trying to think new models of companies. And when we try to think about what a digital company can do, what is intrinsic about the digital world that can help us create something better that simply cannot be possibly made in the world of traditional or legacy jurisdictions. So there's, after the whole ICO craze, that definitely there was a lot of noise in that, and there's a lot of scams, and it led to a huge mushrooming of the perception of the space as a whole. But we definitely need to improve that a lot. And now there's some new ideas emerging in the field of DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, that can find mechanisms of continuous racing. There's this concept of continuous organizations where the model is you peg the profits that an entity generates with the share issuance mechanism of that entity. So if the entity grows with profits, it also allows for the issuance of more shares throughout time in an automated way, in a computed way. There's also the concept, there's a very interesting experiment now going on in Ethereum called Moloch. Moloch is a DAO that has 25 members. You have to get bought in to become a member. And there's a tribute of 100 ETH. So you really have to have some skin in the game. 100 ETH is around $25,000. It will be 250 maybe one day. But the interesting thing about Moloch is really 400 lines of code. It's really simple code. And it has one function, which I think is a really interesting idea, called the rage quit. And if you do a rage quit at any given time, you can exit the DAO with your funds. So this allows for the majority of the voters in this DAO to make sure that they don't disenfranchise much the minority on the votes, because at any given time, a minority can split and leave with their funds from the organization. So this rage quit function keeps the cohesive nature of the DAO while reducing the risk for investors. Investors can join and can leave at any given time. So these are some of the properties that thinking about the concept of creating entities or companies in a digital way looks much more interesting than the way we deal with risk and assets and investments in the traditional world. So what I wonder is, well, how can some of these ideas help not only fund for-profit projects, but also fund political movements, fund all kinds of organizations that are trying to address challenges in society and apply some of these innovations beyond the scope of just finance. So I think we're getting exciting tools, really powerful tools to start building an alternative. The challenge now is to make sure that these tools are easier to use, that have better user experience, and that can reach anyone from any country. I come from Argentina. Structuring a legal company in Argentina is a bureaucratic nightmare, but suddenly giving an equal chance for anyone anywhere in the world through the use of the internet to structure companies and to engage with projects in this type of economies, regardless of where you were born, I think that levels up the playing field for everyone. So I'm definitely long on the internet and these networks, regardless of how these networks are today exploiting the traditional legacy politics we have.
Interesting. So the way that I think about this is from a kind of an economics angle. We now have the ability to get a new kind of economic efficiency, which I would refer to as economies of omniscience. So we've got economies of scale, which gives you industrialization. We've got economies of agility, which give you the startup world. Economies of omniscience are where you basically know everything about a situation, and then you use it to make optimal decisions. In the environment that we have right now, practically the only way that we're using economies of omniscience is to show people the best possible advert to show them to get them to buy something. Right? We know huge amounts of information about people, but all we're really using that information for is targeting adverts, and all of that money is winding up inside of companies whose business model is to target adverts. Facebook and Google and all the rest. Right? But there are vastly larger sums of money left on the table by this approach than are actually extracted by it. Right? You know, the markets that we interact with for our everyday functions are completely illiquid and completely irrational. Right? Probably everybody in this room has had a nightmare experience trying to find a place to live in London. Right? Whether you're renting it or whether you're buying it, access to information is very poor. We lack things like optionality. It's incredibly difficult to get in contact with people that might be able to help you. So if you take a new job, right, you really want to live in a place that has the shortest possible commute to work. If you've got kids, that's now constrained because you want to balance schooling versus your commute time. And all these things are kind of systems of constraints. If we had access to all of the information about housing in London, you could do things like take a new job and 50 people then approach you, just swap houses with you because they want to be closer to where you are, you want to be closer to where your workplace is. It might be a 4 or 5 person swap where everybody shuffles around, and at the end of it, everybody's got more of what they wanted for exactly the same amount of money they're paying now. Right? And the entirety of society has opportunities like that just lying around. And we've got all the information, but it's in the wrong structures for us to be able to exploit that possibility. Same thing with allergies, right? If you swipe a credit card in a shop and you have, say, a peanut allergy, you ought to get an automated block on your card that says, hey, you just bought something with a peanut in it. You're going to have to confirm that transaction before we'll let it happen, right? The manufacturer knows what's in the stuff. The shop knows what stuff you've bought. All we need to do is tell the credit card company you have an allergy, and we could tie those stories together into a new kind of function. So to me, the sort of wastefulness of this ad-driven internet economy is that it's totally failed to do fundamental, structural, beneficial transformation, and it's left us with a bunch of advertising crap rather than fundamentally more efficient and more enjoyable lives, which is what's right there on the table. And then you look at things like the Chinese social credit system, or indeed American credit ratings, right? It's essentially the same system. It's just in America it's done by private companies. It's absolutely true, right? Credit rating and social credit, it's the same idea. Those kinds of systems, could be operated for the general welfare, right? Those things could be, those databases could be used to help people find jobs, to help people get appropriate education. There's so much more value in these systems that we're not touching because we just don't have the correct structural organization to pull that value out. And I mean, to me, this is the whole sort of thesis of what I wanted to see from blockchain, is I wanted to see fundamental economic transformation at this level of the economies of omniscience, and the transfer of the value that was being extracted from those economies, instead of it being held by private companies, held by either individuals or by collectives, or indeed by municipalities and even the state.
So I'm not sure if such systems fascinate me or scare me if we're able to use the full extent of data that is available today. And I guess we just have to move away from sort of, as Google did, from their old mode of don't be evil, which they recently discarded, but move away to systems that are fundamentally built in a way that they just can't be evil. No matter how much data they have, they can't be used against their users. But on that note, I think we have to wrap it up. I'm getting signaled that we've reached the top of our hour, so please give a round of applause to our speakers.